It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. John Collier as our distinguished guest of honour. The Guild would sincerely like to thank Dr. Collier for taking time and accepting the Guild's invitation as our guest of honour. Dr. John Collier was appointed Headmaster of Shaw in July 2022. Previously, he was the head of St Andrew's Cathedral School and head of St Andrew's Cathedral Gurrowa Indigenous School for 12 years from 2010 to 2021. Prior to that, was principal of a multi-denominational Christian school and a government school ranging over 33 years of principalship. From the beginning of 2022, Dr. Collier was appointed to the position of Dean of Education at Morling Baptist College. He is a past chair of AHESA, New South Wales and ACT, and is a fellow of both the Australian College for Educators and Australian College for Educational Leaders. For 7 years, he chaired the academic committee of AHESA, New South Wales and ACT, and he's a past recipient of the Alan Loughlin Perpetual Award and of the Principals Australia Institute John Lang Professional Development Award. In 2018, he was awarded the Sir Harold Wyndham Medal for Educational Leadership by the Australian College of Educators. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. John Collier.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for the introduction, and thank you very much to Fred and to the committee for the invitation to address you tonight, and indeed for the fellowship itself. As I listened to the citations, I thought I was probably in the wrong place, given the stellar achievements of so many, but I'll take it. And I must say, anything that I might have helped others achieve in some way through wandering through schools for 51 years is largely due to the woman who's been sitting next to me, my lovely wife Kate of 43 years of marriage. We're getting close. We're getting close to working out what this marriage business is about. And it's rare for Kate to come and listen to me speak. She usually says, well, I've really been listening to you for nearly 50 years. But anyway, here she is tonight, so the menu is obviously attractive. So I know some of you well, and you've known that I was to be the speaker, but you've come anyway. So thank you for that. And you've come, even though you could have spent the evening watching the World Cup football, or the World Cup netball, or the Test cricket in Surrey at the Oval. And that's where Kate would normally have been, in front of all of those channel surfing between them and cheering on Pat Cummins. Why? Well, there's a story there. She maintains that she's taught him everything he knows, which is true probably in the domain of food technology. So, look, I'm a retread. I'd finished in schools and I was enjoying the rather rarefied existence as an education academic, and in 6 months I had to manage one critical incident. We ran out of coffee. So suddenly I found myself back in the hurly-burly, and what I do, and this has been my mantra for a while, I think, is to just stumble forward with purpose and intent. And those of you who are senior executives in schools will know that over time you have to become such a generalist and you have so many people with expertise reporting to you that eventually you end up not knowing anything about anything, which I think is pretty much where I am. But part of the crux of leadership is to give a plausible pretense that you know something about something. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to do here with you tonight. So I think Shaw, when they came and got me, thought, well, who's sort of battle hardened and got lots of barnacles, but won't be here for so long that it's a problem. So what will happen in due course is I'll be sent to the knackery, probably via the laundry chute, I think. So I'm going to address the topic with you tonight of the challenges of education in the 21st century, how we function as educators. And a particular disclaimer to begin with: what is generally true of futurists who try to predict such things is they're invariably wrong. So here goes. What I hope to do is to comprehensively alarm and depress you first. So I'm actually quite skilled at that. And then perhaps offer a little bit of salve, a touch of hope and grace, perhaps. So I'm going to begin with the diagnosis because, of course, that's much easier than the solution. And maybe in the discussion we have thereafter, some of you might have some solutions, in which case I shall start taking notes. So, social change, that's my first category, social change. What am I seeing? Well, I'm going to read you the synopsis that Fred asked me to create, and here's what I wrote. It is difficult to think of a time in history when educators are under so much pressure. Derided by politicians and the media for alleged falling standards, unsettled by the pace of technological change and the unknown unknowns of artificial intelligence, they must navigate a society which appears to be atomising into elevated assertions of hyper-individualism. Buffeted by 24/7 electronic contact and the elevation of risk mitigation to a major drain on time, and needing to offer safety amidst the tsunami of mental health issues amongst young people, they appear almost under siege. Nonetheless, teaching remains a noble profession with moral purpose and unique opportunities through shaping young people to influence the future. Amidst an epidemic of angst, they must be purveyors of hope for a future which they co-determine. How can leaders in primary, secondary and tertiary tiers help steer the educational ship to best outcomes amidst the apparent hurricanes? Well, perhaps that might resonate with you. What will resonate with me is that I've enlisted my wife into the role of water girl. May I please? These days the throat complains when it's asked to do too much. So, social change. Section 1, parents. Looking at those who are currently principals, see the nod of recognition. I find most parents are absolutely magnificent. But, you know the 80-20 rule in business. I've always maintained in schools it's the 98-2. The 2% take up 98% of your time. So what are we seeing? Well, as I alluded to a moment ago, hyper-individualism. My child is special, unique. The rules, yes, they're for other people. They don't apply to my child. When I said to you that I wanted firm discipline, I meant discipline of other people's children. Some parents demand a virtual tutoring program of schools. They want one-on-one for their child. The fact that there are other children there is not relevant to them. All children are special. That's right, but not necessarily special in the way that parents mean. Often what they mean is not subject to the same strictures. So for many there's a castle mentality where they will circle the wagons to defend the child. And that's very difficult for everybody. I've had a few situations in my time when I've said to parents, if you don't leave my office now, I will ring the police. It's not my opening statement. Increasingly, we're in a service industry. And so some of the mentality that applies to us where our clients, that word itself is problematic, our clients actually have a consumer mentality. And so they're quite happy to bring back the product and go somewhere else. There's no real brand loyalty in many places. And I had cause to quote to a particular group of parents Bruce Dawes' poem, The Drifter. The name of the poem really gives you the message. I had one child at a school where I worked with Dr. Silburn, who was in Year 10, and that school was her 25th school. Parents are often happy to berate staff, and in that particular school, the principal of the next school up the line had a baseball bat under his desk. And I asked him why, and he said it's to do with parents. I haven't seen a lot of that for a very long time, I'm glad to say. So often parents don't recognise that teachers have multiple children, not just their child, and they can't really grasp why the child's interests are not your main agenda. Child does taekwondo, why isn't that the school's main sport? As a lawyer parent said to me at my last school. There's pressure on teachers after COVID lockdown to operate in hybrid mode. I've resisted that. I've said it's too hard to do both simultaneously. It's too hard, it's too demanding, can't be done. Are we heading towards de-schooling? Are we going back to Ivan Illich? Wind back the clock? I don't know. Many parents will wrap their children in cotton wool, engage in helicopter parenting, or the worst cases these days are called Black Hawk parenting, or beyond that, lawnmower parenting, where before a problem arises, parents arrive to mow the turf to make things straight for their child. I had this conversation at my last school with a parent who was particularly given to this kind of behaviour, and so to try to sort of move me in his thinking, I described another parent that I'd heard of who had a drone following his child with a camera all day. He had this playing in the background in his office just to make sure the boy was okay, high school. And this parent thought that was a really good idea. Secondly, the happiness movement. Every time a parent says to me, often on the sporting field, and it's happened in multiple schools, I just want my child to be happy. I blanch at that. Because often what the parent really means is, I don't want my child to ever have to face anything difficult, but I expect you to give me a resilient child. Huh? So that's a problem, because the pursuit of happiness is bound to fail, I think, if that's the end. Happiness comes as a product of leading a life of purpose and significance. It can't be pursued as an end in itself. We have a tsunami of mental health issues amongst our children, and the statistics are horrifying. They're appalling. And if you read anything from the Black Dog Institute or from Professor Patrick McGorry and such experts, it's chilling. It really is. We have hypersexualisation of children from a young age, which I would argue plays into mental health issues, and free access to pornography. So I read a statistic as to the proportion of boys who've seen pornography, whether intentionally or otherwise, by the age of 16. What was the proportion? 100%. objectification of women, destruction of relationships, the collapse of ethical standards and boundaries. Sometimes when I talk to students about morals, they think I'm talking about morale. The category doesn't register. These are difficult matters to negotiate. And currently in high schools we're dealing with a consent movement, which seems to me to be far from a panacea, where the notion of consent can be tissue thin, and where the great advocate for protection of children, Melissa Tankard-Rice, says the prospects of consent triumphing over the trillion-dollar international porn industry are zero. Chilling stuff. We're dealing with that in schools. And we're dealing with it partly because of the collapse of other institutions and because parents often don't know what to do, or they would like to outsource the child to us, to you. At my last school we had one child in Year 12 where the parent appointed a second PA and her role simply was to deal with the school about the child. He didn't want to know or be involved. It didn't end well. And so there's the challengeable idea to our teenagers that they must be sexually active now if they're to be fulfilled people. Schools and education are often seen as salvific. We will solve every problem, as well, of course, as teaching the curriculum and getting brilliant results. It's a big load, and those things are pushed on to us because other institutions, other agencies aren't dealing with them. And as an additional issue, we're struggling now with issues of gender identity, which are enough to stress and stretch anybody in a school. So now that I've given you all that good news about parents, I'll move on to kids, the students themselves. Increasingly in schools, students want their teachers to be entertaining. This is partly because that's their life. Life is full of sound and light and buzz, and school for some is simply a part of their social life, with annoying interruptions by teachers teaching classes, which they'll push into the background as far as possible. And so it leads to reduced concentration spans, because students are used to images quickly moving on. But the teacher annoyingly is there in front of them for somewhere between 35 and 53 minutes in a high school, or 63 minutes, and in primary school, all day. All day, Lucy, all day. So students are severely distracted from our goals and aims, and many of them are exhausted because they are sleep deprived due to the fact that they are available online all night, because they have their devices in their bedrooms, because often the parents won't prevent that. I had a meeting with a parent some years ago where I'd just declared his Year 11 son's place vacant under the Nesta rules. The boy had for quite a long time arrived at school at the end of lunch. He'd been up all night on his device, and I said to the father, who was a professor, not a silly man, "Why haven't you taken the phone away from him at bedtime?" To which he replied, "I couldn't do that, he wouldn't like it." Fear of missing out drives many young people. But they're very vulnerable, because social media can often be a toxic cauldron of bullying, and often vulnerable people have their self-esteem floating on the number of likes they get to their postings. It's very problematic. And young people who think, and they're increasingly doing that, are appalled at what they see. What do they see? They see climate change out of control to the extent that they fear that it will extinguish life on this planet, even within their lifespan, and adults are not taking it seriously. They see the geopolitical situation, Ukraine, Myanmar, South Sudan, the Congo, those things which come across their TV screens with constant images of destruction and misery and hardship. They look at the economy in their own country in Australia and wonder, will there be a job there for me in the future? They look at the housing market. Where can I live? Am I stuck with the old folks forever? And they're driven deeply by concern over inclusivity and disadvantage and discrimination because they're young idealists. And so that can result in either activism or resignation in sheer frustration. Information technology. One for you, Annie. The difficulty of competing in the digital world of excitement and stimulation, which is the home turf of young people, but often foreign to those who seek to teach them. If Kate and I want to know anything about IT, we ask our youngest child. That seems to be the way of it. AI, what will that mean for us? I said to the parent body at my last school, I might be replaced by a robot as principal. And they were kind enough to say they didn't want that, and they went one further and they said, we want you here forever. So we're engaging a taxidermist. It was kind of nice, in a way. AI and plagiarism. Isn't that big? The changes of delivery of education through IT. What's that going to mean? Where are we going? I don't know. I hope you do, someone in the room. Transhumanism. That's huge. Have you read in the paper over the last couple of months a number of experts who've said, what I've produced in the AI realm is a sentient being. What I've produced has emotions. What did Stephen Hawking say on his deathbed was the greatest threat facing humanity? Climate change? No. Artificial intelligence, which might decide that the human race was superfluous. That's what Hawking said. Interesting, if that's the word. Structures. In schools, we continue with what's essentially an industrial revolution factory model of schooling. We do that because it's kind of cheap for government, because that's what we're trained to do, and because no one's come up with an alternative that is particularly viable, unless it be all online. And we know, as educators, the advantage of online, but also the shortfalls. Here's one close to home at the moment, where I am. Will boys' schools cease to exist? Is Sydney one of the last bastions in the world of boys' schools? And something very related to boys' schools in particular, but not just boys' schools, is masculinity inherently toxic? That's something to think about in a school with boys. And there are many social commentators who will answer yes to that. I had that problem 20 years ago in a school where some of the younger women pushed back against doing anything for boys because they said it was an attack on feminism. I came up with a solution. I waited for them to have sons. Didn't have to wait long. Worked wonderfully. They became huge advocates for boys' education. Here's a Pat Cummins bouncer. The law. Children's rights increasingly empowered through the law. I made the pilgrimage to Finland, as many did after the extraordinary results in PISA and TIMSS. And the Finns said, well, it's all over now, because social change in Finland is such that the kids are all called by their first names. We're not allowed to say anything about them to their parents unless they give us permission. It's game over for us. Interesting. Anti-discrimination legislation, that's a challenge. For those of us who run schools with a religious framework, freedom of religion can we continue to employ staff that we think meet our ethos? I object in principle to the government telling me who I can employ, given baseline issues such as they're all properly teacher trained and accredited and so forth. Flexibility, increasingly the demand for staff that we be very flexible, that they can go part-time on demand, irrespective of timetables and staffing and the rest of that. Risk. Who invented risk? It's a huge challenge. We could spend all our time just dealing with risk, and some of the governance agencies that speak to school councils say to them, your agenda in your meeting should simply be about managing risk. I'm thinking, well, we're not here to manage risk as our core business. That's a facilitating mechanism, but that's not actually what we do. Some time ago, I decided that all my communication to parents had to consider a secondary audience of either their lawyer or the media or both. That's just being careful. Costs. How do we keep running schools that cost money, that stretch parents financially? The Education Resource Index is increasing more rapidly than inflation, and so our fees keep going up and up. What's the elasticity of parents' capacity to pay? We don't know. In a sense, we don't want to find out. And so amongst some independent schools, there's a kind of facilities war to gazump one another to get the best facilities that will entice enrolments. And that's unfortunate. While within the whole issue of sectors, the sectarian warfare between the sectors has not entirely gone away. To the loss of everybody, I think. We would do much better to combine and speak with one voice to government. Teachers. A lot of the expectations of our teachers were formulated at the time when one man worked while the wife stayed at home. And if the woman got married, she had to resign. Many of our structures and expectations have not changed significantly since that time. Meanwhile, the teaching force is ageing, and the pipeline of new teachers is clearly insufficient. So we're in trouble nationally. How can we replenish the pipeline when there are attacks in the media on the efficacy of teachers, when the working conditions don't seem particularly attractive? It'd be nice to have running water in staff rooms, and it'd be nice if the mice didn't come. And the salary starts good and then stops being good because there isn't the capacity to increase unless you are promoted quickly. The stress is significant. The workload is great. There's a lack of progression for people, often a lack of opportunity. Have you ever tried persuading your most able Year 12 students to consider teaching? That's a thankless task. And in elite schools, it's hardly worth attempting because many of the parents regard teaching as servile. Their focus for their young people is on medicine or law. It's a hard gig. Meanwhile, teachers increasingly must deal with compliance, huge issue, pastoral care, which has leapt to the fore even though few of us are trained in that area, parents, risk, bureaucracy, programming. No longer does it all come from the department or the precursor of NESO in a neat package. You've actually got to do it yourself. Assessments, co-curricular, and on it goes. There's been a recent study driven by Federation University with joint work from some other universities, and they've quoted what a number of teachers have said to them. And here's one extract. As a teacher, you have never done enough. You work and work and work, creating, thinking, planning to get the best for each student, and it's still never enough. You still can't help so many students. You never satisfy the administration load and so much pressure from parents. When you are a high-achieving person, teaching sets you up for failure because you are never enough for everybody. Well, yes. I tell my staff at Shaw, who are magnificent, by the way, they're incredibly hard-working and committed. I tell them, you've got to put some boundaries around yourself. You've got to survive. This has got to be sustainable for you. And some of you are young enough that most of the students you teach in your career are not yet born, and you need to save something in the tank for them. I also say to them, well, look at me, I burnt out decades ago. I just kept going to work every day. Here's another quotation. I became a teacher because I'm passionate about equipping the next generation to be their best. That's the kind of teacher I want in my school. The education sector is making this harder and harder from a wellbeing perspective and from an educational perspective. The curriculum is crowded. Students are pressured to succeed. Teachers are trashed in the media. There is little understanding of the complexity of these roles by those outside of schools. So we've got the issue not just of finding excellent people who are prepared to be recruited into teaching, we've got the problem of holding the ones we've got, given so many of the social forces that make it difficult for them. So we're seeing teachers go through some universities which have downgraded teacher education, which have subsumed it into other faculties, and which are looking at the education faculty as a cash cow where they can maximise the number of students and limit the outlays. This is a problem. I am a teacher education academic, by the way, in all my spare time, and I'm very glad to say, here's the word from our sponsor, here's the commercial. At Moreland College, we are already doing many of the things that the Scott Report has recommended, particularly an emphasis on quality practicum, quality supervision in their practicum, and good experience in schools. Now, the media have sensationalised and weaponised this, and the way they're reporting this is we need less social theory and more practical application. Well, that's probably a little bit harsher than the report itself is saying, but that's the narrative at the moment. If you are in tertiary, I'm sorry. Let me apologise on behalf of Australia to you. Because what's happening? Well, those of you in tertiary can tell us all what's happening. Politicians demand we be the clever country, and then they remove resources, which might enable you to have a reasonable crack at making it so. So there's a brain drain. One of our sons is an instance of that. He's an academic scientist, and he's gone to work in South Africa because South Africa, a third world country, funds science. Australia, a first world country, does not. And so many academics have to be entrepreneurial, and instead of doing what they're best at, which is research and teaching, they're writing endless grant submissions to stay afloat. And so they're dealing with redundancies and casualisation of the workforce and very unattractive salaries. Many of you know this. And some governments actually seem to regard academics in general and universities overall as their class war enemies. So let's freeze out their funding. This is extremely difficult. And it's hard to postulate a wonderful future on that basis. Politicians. I've worked with a lot of politicians in my time. Sigh. So many politicians see education as simply part of the productivity agenda. And for that matter, so do business councils. And so our role as educators is to develop suitable cogs for the machinery of the economy. That is an awfully reductionist view, and I always push back at that. Politicians are obsessed with PISA and NAPLAN because there are numbers there and they can relate to a number, and they offer the absurd idea that this is somehow a measure of quality of education in this country. The idea is absurd. If you want to know why, I'll get on a soapbox later and harangue you for half an hour, but I won't do that now. Politicians' eye is on the next election. Our electoral cycles in Australia are very, very short, and so they're always campaigning and looking at the short time frame. And so we have the wonder of inquiries and announcements, which they won't have to actually materialise or implement because there'll be an election and they'll either lose or they'll be in a different portfolio. And so they commission endless reviews of the syllabus, and poor people here in the room have to administer that. Leaders. I'm on my last page, you'll be glad to know. Leaders. We are on the treadmill. And there's a treadmill. You run faster and faster. I get to work on Monday and think, Friday, that's an awfully long way off. Can I survive till Friday? Now, that's actually not quite right, because my brain says, well, you've also got to survive Saturday sport and Saturday performing arts and Sunday reading the 280 pages of reports that are just logged into your inbox on Friday afternoon that are ready for the council meeting on Tuesday night. So 24/7 workload. I got a phone call the night before last of an outrage in the boarding school, which put everybody into a spin. Turned out to be a complete furphy, hadn't actually happened, but enough to occupy the evening. Work-life balance. What is that? And some of the most stressed teachers I have at Shaw are young mothers who have an enormous load at home and are trying to be comprehensively professional and excellent at school. And they are, but there's a considerable toll. I was fortunate enough to be the only Australian head of a school that represented at the International Principals Confederation Executive Conference in Cairns some years ago, where we had Professor Philip Riley speaking to us, the expert on principal stress. And one thing he said was unforgettable. He said, a quarter of the principals in Australia have post-traumatic stress disorder, the equivalent of a Vietnam veteran. Wow. So leadership is hard. And those who do lead know that, and there's a shortage of people prepared to do it, which is worrying for the future. Have I depressed you sufficiently, or shall I go on? Is that enough? Well, let me turn to the positives. I'm afraid they're shorter because, as I said, easier to diagnose than solve. Sorry about that. Hope you've got the answer. Here it is. If I were to have my career choice again, I would choose to do exactly the same thing, without hesitation. Being able to be involved with young people, by which I mean 4-year-olds to university students, is an enormous privilege. It's exciting. It's immensely fulfilling. I actually draw strength from the young people with whom I work. I manage to appropriate their energy somehow. It keeps me young. There's enormous fulfilment in seeing what they can do. And so many of them are simply brilliant. And, well, I said to a boy today who's 17, who's been the editor of the weekly newsletter, Justin, you write with an extraordinary sophistication and quality, and most adults never achieve what you've achieved in their lifetimes. It's true. Last year at Shaw, I found out that the norm, Doug will know all this, the norm at Shaw is that in the last week, the first debating team debates the staff, and the headmaster is the opening speaker for the staff. Didn't see any way I could actually back out. And our topic was, students should make all the important decisions in the school. And the staff had to argue the affirmative, and I was the first speaker. And we won. We won. And I said to one of the deputies, to Andrew, does this mean that we've got to cede control to the first prefect and the second prefect, the senior prefect and the second prefect, school captain and vice captain? And Andrew said, it would be fine, because Henry and Toby could run the school. And I thought, yes, they could. Yes, that's right. So we have the extraordinary privilege of being able to hang around with extraordinary young people, full of energy and compassion and intelligence and drive. What could be better than that? We can make a difference in their lives. We're not operating for profit or to make some offshore Mandarin wealthy. We're building into people. It has a moral purpose. We're moulding the future through the next generation. It's one of the most important things that can be done in society. And we have the privilege of doing that at whatever level we operate, from preschool to university. And one of my constant themes with staff is this. Yes, there's degradation and despair all around. It comes through the television every night. It's packaged to look that way, but it is grim in many cases. One of our fundamental roles as educators is to be purveyors of hope. We have to give hope. We have to so set ourselves that we lift the horizons of young people and do our best to imbue them with the kind of hope that energises them to do something. And so in a sense that's my message crystallised to Year 12 at the last day address. Do something, in the rest of your life. Do something. I do extrapolate on it rather more than that, but So, why do I keep going? As someone reflected to me yesterday, and he summarised it for me, having looked into my soul. I keep going because of the joy of working with fabulous young people. And I would include most of the young people with whom I work in that category. They're fabulous young people. They're alive in the best sense of the word. They're beautiful people. And so that energises me. What we do could be described and has been described, particularly if you're a leader, as the best job in the world, but with some of the worst days in the world. And I've received those phone calls from the police. I'm having to ring you to tell you that one of your students has died. It has some of the worst days in the world. But we are co-creators of the future because of what we can do with young people. We're the gatekeepers, really. It's a vital role. It's a dignified role. It may not be remunerated at that level. It may not get the respect it deserves. But what you do is critical to the future of this nation and beyond. It's up to us, because who else is going to do it? So what's the purpose of education? Well, I've kind of alluded to that, but here are some possibilities. To win votes for politicians, that's its fundamental purpose, isn't it? To lift productivity. Really? To advance STEM, or if you like, STEAM. I'm all in favour of that, but not just that. I want to advance everything. To teach knowledge, to pass on the culture of the past, to teach skills, to teach young people to collaborate, to be critical and creative thinkers. The purpose of education is to go back to basics. Let's get rid of all the fluff. Just English and mathematics, nothing else. Really? The purpose of education is to solve society's problems and make sure they get an ATTA of 99.95. Well, could be that. The purpose of education is to deliver a solid classical education. Yes? No. To teach values. To help people critique. The purpose of education is to convince young people of their intrinsic worth. It is to teach skills, to make them future ready. The purpose of education is metacognition, to teach young people to think. The purpose of education is to help young people to be nimble and agile. The purpose of education is character development, to give them ethics. The purpose of education is to make them great. As one parent said to me at my last school, when her children, she and her husband's children, they said it together, were in the junior school, your role is to produce future Olympians. I said, no, it's not. Now, here's the good news for me, as well as for my good friend Ross and my good friend Anna. We can shuffle off soon. Leave it to you. This is what W.B. Yeats said in his great poem Sailing to Byzantium. This is no country for old men. Ross, you and I. I'm older than you. The young in one another's arms. Really must strengthen the playground supervision roster. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of unageing intellect. Me. So it'll be our time soon, some of us to shuffle off. I'm going to toddle off to the Elysian fields of my own version of Arcadia, drink the wine of vintage years. Got some of it there on my desk, on my table. I'll be in the Lord's waiting room, just waiting for the Banshee whale to come and pull me on board and fly off. So I hope you find the diagnosis resonates. I hope you find that there is purpose and value and enormous intrinsic worth in what you do. And keeping doing it and doing it brilliantly is our profession's only answer. We do it with preschool children, we do it with primary age children, we do it with high school children, we do it with, shall I say, university children. I'm old enough to be able to say that. That's the antidote, as far as we can do it. What will the future be like? I don't know. It'll be more technologically driven. We'll have to adjust to that, but there's no charge to us to lose our identity as teachers. The role of the teacher will always matter. We might use machines as our servants, but they won't replace us, and we won't be their slaves. And so as the IT world unfolds further, we need to do what my deputy academic has urged staff to do. Don't be frightened. We will appropriate it for good and put up our force fields against that which is not so good, so that we can take it on board and utilise it rather than be driven or destroyed by it. I'm going to sit down and have some more water. Thank you for listening. Let me just say it's very good of you to listen with the Test cricket on, and at my last school I well recall when the Test cricket was on during the day at the Sydney Cricket Ground, I was saying something incredibly important to staff on the last day in full flight in my address, and someone suddenly yelled out the cricket score. and it was a bit problematic that it was my son.
Thank you, Dr. John Collier, for your, I would say for me personally, very encouraging words for the profession that I chose to join. And as we say for our motto, I teach that I may learn, it is very true that we keep going out there to do the best that we can for the future generations. So thank you so much once again. I would like to now welcome Mr. Rick Stevens, Life Member of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales, for the vote of thanks. If you can give him a warm welcome.
Well, Mr. President, fellows and guests, thank you, Fred, wherever you are, you've disappeared. Thank you, Fred, for affording me the privilege of proposing a vote of thanks to such an eminent educator. John, that's why we're here, and we've trumped FIFA and the Test cricket. I've had an association with John over many years, chiefly through our involvement in with education in Sydney Anglican schools. So it's a great honour to say a few words. John, you've established yourself over a very long involvement in schools and professional groups across several sectors: teaching, leading, writing, and as a person others turn to for advice. And I think you've demonstrated these qualities tonight with your incisive observation and comments, with a good dose of humour. You always have the knack of drilling down to what really matters and provoking reflection and contemplation about how we can all improve and advance the practice of positive learning and teaching in our schools. Thank you for focusing us on the many significant challenges teachers and leaders face. Challenges that frequently, I think, seem to have uncertain outcomes. But thank you also for pointing out the positives. That teaching remains a noble profession, and that we must be very important influencers of hope for the future, whatever that might look like. And we are indeed to be heroic souls. John, we thank you again for your significant contribution to this important occasion. And again, we offer our warmest congratulations to you on your well-deserved honorary fellowship. Please join me in thanking Dr. John Collier.